When a regime collapses, its men don't disappear, they move. And the question that nobody is asking loudly enough right now is this: where are they going? Operation Epic Fury is dismantling Iranian military structures at a speed that few experts had anticipated. Ballistic missile sites are being struck. Nuclear enrichment facilities are being targeted. Key regime leaders are being eliminated one after another. The Houthis, Hezbollah, the pro-Iranian militias scattered across the Middle East. That entire architecture of power that Tehran spent 40 years building, financing, arming, and training across a dozen countries, all of it is being shattered. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that Western governments do not yet seem to be taking seriously with the gravity it deserves. When you destroy a network, you do not destroy its members. You scatter them, and scattered people, with experience, money, connections, and an intact ideology, are infinitely more dangerous than people grouped together in a conflict zone that you can monitor, target, and strike. This is exactly what Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a researcher at the Hudson Institute, warned this week, and her words deserve to be heard, not because she speaks from some disconnected academic chair, but because she knows these networks from the inside. She grew up within them. She fled. She has spent decades studying them, documenting them, and warning governments that, for the most part, chose not to listen. What she is saying is simple, what she is saying is brutal, and what she is saying should keep you up at night. The Islamists driven out of the Middle East by American and Israeli strikes are going to try to come to the West. They are going to try to come to America. They are going to come to Europe. Not as refugees fleeing war, as operators looking for new ground, as networks seeking to reconstitute themselves somewhere that drone strikes cannot reach them, somewhere that laws protect them, somewhere that borders are porous, somewhere that entire communities can serve as cover, financing, and recruitment. Think about what that means in concrete terms. For decades, Iran was the conductor of a system of military and political proxies stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq. That system was not made only of soldiers and rocket launchers. It was made of financiers, ideologues, recruiters, propagandists, money transfer facilitators, digital communication experts, influence networks inside universities, inside mosques, inside non-governmental organizations, inside political parties. It is an entire ecosystem, and that ecosystem, when it loses its geographical anchor in the Middle East, does not die. It migrates. Europe is the most obvious destination, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali does not mince her words on this subject. She argues that the liberal open border policies practiced by many European governments for years have created ideal conditions for these networks to establish themselves, thrive, and accumulate what she calls enormous political and financial weight. This is not an abstract theory. It is an observable reality in dozens of European cities where organized Islamist movements have built parallel structures, schools, associations, mutual aid networks that operate according to their own rules, with their own agenda, entirely beneath the radar of the state. And then there is what she calls the Red-Green Alliance. This concept deserves close attention because it explains something that many people observe without knowing how to name it. On one side, you have the far-left movements, communists, Marxists, anarchists, everything that sits at the radical margins of left-wing politics. On the other side, you have Islamist movements. These two forces seem opposed in every way. One is secular, the other is religious. One promotes a certain vision of individual liberation, the other imposes strict codes of behavior. How can they possibly be allies? The answer is that they share a common enemy: the liberal Western order, the American-led world system, Israel, Western capitalism, liberal democratic culture. On these precise points, the radical far left and radical Islamism converge, not on everything, not on their ideal vision of the world, but on what they want to destroy. And in contemporary politics, sharing a common enemy is often enough to create coalitions that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. This alliance expresses itself in Western universities, where radical pro-Palestinian movements have been joined by far-left groups that would have had no ideological affinity with Islamism in any other context. It expresses itself in street protests, where Islamist slogans and Marxist slogans appear side by side. It expresses itself in European parliaments, where certain radical left parties have built electoral alliances with candidates clearly inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood or their Shia equivalents. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is not the first to identify this phenomenon, but she is perhaps the most credible voice to do so, precisely because she does not come from the political right. She comes from inside the world she is describing, and that makes her warning infinitely harder to dismiss. Now let's talk about America, because the situation there is different, but not necessarily less concerning. Hirsi Ali acknowledges that the current administration has closed the borders, and she explicitly thanks Donald Trump for that. Closing the borders reduces the incoming flow, but it does not solve the problem of networks already in place, and this is where the next phase becomes critical. She is calling for a systematic examination of what she calls subversion networks across the entire United States. Islamist structures, whether linked to Sunni Muslim Brotherhood branches or their pro-Iranian Shia equivalents, that operate legally, openly, but with agendas that are not always what they claim to be. This is not a new idea. Counterterrorism experts have been warning for years about the presence of sleeper cells introduced into the United States, about financing networks that move through charitable organizations, about influence structures that have penetrated academic and political circles. What is new is the urgency, because Operation Epic Fury is creating unprecedented pressure on these networks abroad, and that pressure is going to translate into an increased need for resources, safe havens, and new operational bases elsewhere. The logic is relentless. When you tighten the military vice in the Middle East, you mechanically increase the pressure on the western branches of these networks. You are demanding that they do more with less. You are forcing them to absorb operators arriving from active conflict zones with skills, connections, and a radicalization that has been hardened in the fire of real combat. And here is the fundamental question we all need to ask ourselves. Are we ready for that? Because the war in the Middle East, as spectacular as it is, as decisive as the American and Israeli military victories appear to be, does not end when the last Iranian missiles fall. It enters a new phase, a less visible phase, less cinematic, but potentially more dangerous for ordinary citizens in Europe and America than all the airstrikes combined. Domestic terrorism inspired by these networks does not require centralized command. It does not require complex logistics. It requires radicalized individuals, an ideology that gives them the sense of a sacred mission and a target. All three of those elements are already present on Western soil. The question is whether the intelligence services, the law enforcement agencies, and above all the governments that define policy have the intellectual clarity and the political courage to look reality in the face and act accordingly. Europe has a window. It is narrow. The coming months, during which these networks will seek to reposition themselves, find new financing, and absorb new arrivals coming from a collapsing Middle Eastern order, represent an opportunity to map, infiltrate, and neutralize these structures before they consolidate in their new configuration. But that window will close. And if European governments, paralyzed by their own political contradictions, by the fear of being accused of Islamophobia, by electoral calculations linked to Muslim diaspora communities that represent significant voting blocs in many constituencies, if those governments decide once again to look the other way, then Ayaan Hirsi Ali's warning will remain in the archives as a prophecy that nobody wanted to hear. That would be a historic mistake. Not the first, but perhaps one of the most costly, because what we are talking about is not an abstract and distant threat. These are real networks with real members who have real skills acquired in real conflict zones and who are going to seek to establish themselves in your cities, in your countries, near your children. Operation Epic Fury may be winning the war in the Middle East, but the war for the West is beginning now, and it will not be won with torpedoes and airstrikes. It will be won with vigilance, with clarity of thought, and with the willingness to call things what they are, even when it is politically uncomfortable. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has sounded the alarm. The question is whether anyone is going to hear it before it is too late.